Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Dancing Professor. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the origins of human factors, more specifically, industrialization and the effects of the Industrial Revolution on technology. We're going to begin by discussing some of the early experiments of human factors. After that, we're going to see how those advances had been taken into effect in World War II, and then following World War II, how the development of household appliances actually affected the use of technology in homes. And we're going to finish talking about the influence of computers as well as the introduction of the internet and the World Wide Web on how we use technology today. So some of the early experiments in the field of human factors were conducted by Frederick Taylor as early as the year 1907. So compared to a lot of the other fields of psychology or domains that we've studied, this is actually a fairly recent and fairly new branch. And actually, Frederick Taylor started time and motion studies in a Midvale Steel Company. So in this company, with these time and motion studies, he was considering the amount of time it takes to complete a task using the most optimal methods. So in our first episode, we learned that human performance, and more specifically human efficiency, could be counted by limiting the amount of effort that we need to exert in order to complete a particular task. So that's what Taylor was interested in doing, and he was really interested to see how long it took workers to actually perform a particular task. So he studied their productivity, and their main goal was to improve industrial efficiency. So in this steel company, he was measuring and counting and observing how people were using shovels and the most optimal way to actually go about doing that. So because he was able to observe all of these things, he started introducing various techniques, which eventually evolved to a topic known as scientific management and industrial engineering. And if you remember back to our first lecture, we learned that industrial engineering is another word used in human factor psychology. So Taylor really believed that management is key, especially when you start working in an assembly line or when you have to manage a lot of workers. So what he said was that it's very important to plan how a particular job would be performed. So the planning aspect is what seemed to have been missing from the way that these workers were completing their tasks. And so after planning the mental aspect of the job, then he would actually put into effect the manual labor portion, which is executing the particular job. Hence, mental planning plus manual labor would lead to an efficient task. So there's a really popular quote from Mr. Taylor, and it says, "In the past, the man has been first. In the future, the system must be first. The first object of any good system must be that of developing first-class men." So this really focuses on the point that there are particular people with particular characteristics or traits that actually are more designed and better designed to complete certain jobs or to fill certain roles. And so up to this point, people weren't really concerned about that. They were more concerned about getting the job done versus actually considering the type of person who is best suited to get this job done. So Frank and Lillian Gilbreth were a husband and wife team who also conducted systematic and empirical observations on workers. They discovered a new way of bricklaying. So they, while Mr. Taylor worked in a steel company, they actually worked in a bricklaying company. And what they did was they were able to devise a method that reduced the number of steps in a bricklaying process from 18 to less than 5. This increased productivity from 120 to 350 bricks laid per hour. Additionally, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth are known for the caddy hospital technique. So if you ever have been to the doctor or if you've ever watched a surgery take place, right, you might notice that a nurse is handing tools to the surgeon. So actually that is called the caddy technique, and that was implemented by Frank and Lillian Gilbreth because they felt that the surgeon spent too much time away from the patient searching for the proper tool. So they've designed this technique to actually assist them in being more efficient. They also devised army techniques to teach soldiers how to disassemble and reassemble weapons while they were blindfolded and in the dark. So again, we mentioned that during the war, right, human factor psychology really bloomed and blossomed because people were under really high stressful conditions, and it was a matter of life or death depending on how quickly and how efficiently you were able to perform particular tasks. So these techniques really saved a lot of soldiers' lives. Then we have Elton Mayo and F.J. Roethlisberger, who became famous for conducting the Hawthorne studies. You may remember from Psych 150 or your introduction to psychology classes what the Hawthorne studies were. So the Hawthorne studies were based on the idea of reactivity, that people tend to behave differently when they know that they're being watched. However, that was not the original purpose of the Hawthorne experience. It actually has a basis in human factors. So Mayo believed that a worker's productivity would increase if the needs of a worker are considered. For example, how is the temperature in the room? Is there enough light? Is it too dark? Do they have enough breaks? Do they get meal breaks? Do they get any form of rewards or incentives? So it actually turned out that the improvements in efficiency were temporary and due to reactivity, just because the participants knew that they were being watched, so they tended to behave better. However, Mayo became a founding father of human relations movement, and he studied group dynamics in a workplace. So this actually founded the key elements of what we know today as industrial organizational psychology. So if you remember again back to our first lecture, besides the human-computer interaction and the engineering aspect, human factors also deals with ergonomics, with feeling comfortable in your environment and where you work. And a lot of that is affected by the people with whom you work. So I'm not sure about you, but I can definitely say that I've had to work with some people that I did not get along with. You know, some people's energies clash, right? So it's really, really important to understand how your environment can then affect your efficiency at your job. So those actually cover the first three very early experiments known to human factor psychology. Now we're actually going to continue talking about industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, and more specifically the years of the early 1940s, really led to the expansion and explosion of human factor psychology. So we're going to talk about two important things that happened during industrialization. The first thing is World War II. So we will learn that World War II was slightly different from World War I in the sense of the way that it was fought and the machinery that was used for it. And the second thing that really affected our use of technology is the development of household appliances, right? So we'll learn specifically about the different methods that people were using, you know, to do their laundry, to heat their water, things like that, and how with the evolution of technology, those things had become much more simple and much more efficient. So with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, there was an increase in workers looking for jobs and even less of a demand on manual labor. So all of the jobs that people were doing by hand, right, took a significantly longer amount of time than if they were to complete those same tasks in a factory or in an assembly line. So as technology started to advance, the jobs in terms of manual labor started to decrease, and more people were looking for jobs in factories. So while so many studies were focused on productivity and performance and getting things done more quickly, none of these studies really focused on the needs and requirements for satisfaction of these workers, right? And so that actually becomes a priority. So if you think about a job that you've ever had where you felt like your work was going unnoticed, if you've ever if you've ever had a job where you weren't getting paid enough, you never got a bonus, if you didn't have enough breaks, right? Maybe you actually didn't even like the job and you were sad to go to that job every day. So all of those things will affect your productivity and your efficiency when completing the tasks assigned to you at your job. So in 1929, the United Kingdom advanced human factors in a very critical way. They founded what is known today as the Industrial Fatigue Research Board. And it was important that work was carried out efficiently and that productivity was high. Those were the two key components of this board. And even the word fatigue, right, tells us that people get tired at work, right? I'm sure you can relate. So again, in factories and assembly lines, and historically at that time, stress was really high. The country was unstable. So it was very important to consider how a particular worker was feeling, right? Did they have enough food? Did they have enough rest? Because the more you tire a worker out, right, or the more that we get tired, the worse our efficiency becomes, the less productive we are, and the longer it actually takes us to complete a particular task. So this board was comprised of psychologists, engineers, and doctors, and they really focused on problems relating to job design, the working environment, as well as recruiting the appropriate workers for various types of jobs. So this is sort of the beginning of how we talk about personality tests, how career assessments are done, right? All of these things actually originated back in the 1920s and early 1930s. So psychologists were becoming more and more interested in fitting the man to the job versus fitting the job to the man. So in this case, it started to bring humans more and more into the light versus focusing strictly on the job and how to perform it. World War II brought different challenges because it was mainly fought in the air. So we had the introduction of aircraft and aviation, while World War II was fought more on land and on water, in water. So the implementation of quick designs was very necessary, but unfortunately there was not enough time for proper testing. And so we'll notice that some specific examples that we talk about relate specifically to aviation during World War II, just because there was not enough time to conduct thorough tests. So the issue was that the human element was often neglected when designing these systems. So it's not to say that the product didn't perform well or mechanically it wasn't accurately engineered. The issue was that nobody considered how a human would feel while operating this machinery, and so that is sort of the beginning of human factors testing. So because the human element, right, the human factor was not considered, this led to constant errors and inefficient performance, not efficient, inefficient performance. So some examples of such errors included failure to perceive targets on a radar, right? So our attention span is pretty limited, right? Now we know that because we've conducted several studies on attention. However, they were noticing that radar operators were tending to be fatigued and lose their attention span after 20 to 30 minutes. And obviously that makes them less efficient, less able to notice the radar, which of course is very dangerous. So we're going to discuss this more when we talk about vigilance, but this is sort of the reason why we actually study vigilance and why it has been brought to everyone's attention. In another example, an escape hatch for parachutists was not designed with enough clearance for the accommodation of the human and the parachute. So when they were building the escape hatch, they considered the dimensions of like an average person, plus or minus a few inches, but they didn't consider the equipment for the parachutist to wear. And so unfortunately, they didn't realize this until the plane was actually airborne. So parachutists had a difficult time exiting through the escape hatch because the dimensions were not considered for the human and the equipment. A third example involved a poorly designed system in the B-52 bomber airplane. So similar looking controls operated two different things. The first thing was the landing gear, while the other control operated the steering flaps. So what happened was that a pilot would get confused, right? Especially if you imagine in times of high stress, right? You're trying to avoid all this risk. You're trying to avoid, certain things flying at you, obstacles, all of these kind of things. So granted, your adrenaline kicks in and you might pull the wrong lever. So pilots actually ended up operating the wrong controls. And this caused several planes to land on their bellies instead of to safely land. So just to give you a larger picture, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't even know the first place to look. But if you guys know any pilots or anybody in aviation who might be able to point out where the landing gear control is and where the steering flap control is, that's just something interesting to see. But you can see the number of gauges, you can see the number of controls, you could see that there's so much overload on this machine that, granted, when you're trying to save your life and someone else's life, it's very possible to actually pull the wrong switch. So that just gives you an idea about, the kind of work and the kind of stress, a pilot, especially a soldier in aviation, would have to deal with. So these flawed designs began to shift the attention from machines to humans, right? So engineers were like, okay, we have to stop and we have to rethink this because at the end of the day, people are going to be the ones operating these machines, and it's very important to understand whether or not they understand how the machine is intended to work. And so this is relative not only to airplanes, right? This is relative really to any bit of technology that you interact with today, right? So it's very important to understand the intended use of a particular product, and it's very important to understand your audience who will be using that product. So it's important to connect those two together to educate a new user about the way that a particular device or machine or airplane or interface should work before actually putting it into effect. Because again, remember, the way the designer or the engineer had created it is not necessarily the same way that the user will understand to use it. So people began understanding the importance of research on design and human-machine interaction. And so Sir Frederick Bartlett is actually a founding father of human-machine interaction, and he was responsible for building the first simulator of the Spitfire aircraft cockpit with a gentleman named Kenneth Craik. So they investigated the effects of stress and fatigue on pilot behavior. But you can imagine that putting someone in the real world, right, in an airplane and killing an engine, for example, or recreating a war scene is a little dangerous. So the simulator actually allowed them to emulate these certain kind of conditions, but in the safety of a simulator, so that they could experience these things, be prepared for how to operate the aircraft should this actually happen in the real world. And so here's a picture of that first simulator. We actually later in our course, we're going to be interviewing, a modern day pilot, and we're going to actually see how a modern day simulator looks. I promise it's quite different from that, although some things, some similarities do remain. And so we're actually going to talk to them and see how important simulators are in their work and what they actually can do today. So the second thing we're going to talk about is the evolution of household appliances. So the development of household technology really revolutionized society, not only in the way that people were conducting, their daily household chores, but also it affected the way that women and housewives were perceived and the different advances that they were able to take part of, given that their work and their housework had been much, much easier. So hand power was replaced with electric power. For example, to heat water, people would, fill a pot and then heat it over fire. Now with the invention of electric stoves, right, excuse me, people were able to take baths, take showers with these water heaters and heating generators. Coal and wood was replaced by gas and oil, right? So stoves, you didn't have to heat oil for, heat the wood, bring wood, shove it in the stove, and so on and so forth, right? Gas and oil stoves were introduced. Pumping water became running water, so you didn't have to go to the mountain and pump the water into a jar or into a pail, right? Irrigation, all of these things were implemented. Local heating became centralized heating. So in terms of, when in various parts, obviously in California it doesn't get that cold, but in various states, right, it gets very, very cold, and so people would start fires, right? They would have small little ovens. So the centralized heating actually was really, really helpful. And then canned food and refrigeration also changed the way that people ate. At one point, canned food was considered to be not for the upper middle class, right, or for the high class, because people sort of tended to look down on canned food. But as the evolution of these household appliances continued, people understood that, oh, we can do things faster. I can buy like Campbell's soup in a can and then just warm it up, because now I have a way to warm it up quickly. So people didn't have to always cut and make, cut ingredients and make them and cook them from scratch. So canned food and refrigeration also really helped advance even the food we eat today. So the bathroom mania took over also, where cast iron enamelware went into mass production versus custom-made porcelain. So I don't know if you know this, but back in the day, every house had to have a person come and customize particular porcelain sinks, toilets, bathtubs, relative to each particular house. So this changed, right, and it made things much faster, where there was a factory that produced cast iron bathtubs, and they were set to a particular standard. Those standards still exist today. If you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or something, you'll notice that the dimensions of most of the things that they sell are set to a specific standard. Kitchens were created with specific measurements and dimensions in mind. And if you remember our friend Lillian Gilbreth, she actually worked for the General Electric Company, and she interviewed 4,000 women to determine the ideal height for sinks, stoves, and other kitchen fixtures. And so to this day, we still have a particular standard of how high or low, a particular counter should be, like where the refrigerator should be placed, all of these different kinds of things. And so it's interesting that she interviewed 4,000 women, because of course at that time it was not a man's job to cook or clean or spend a lot of time in the kitchen. And so yeah, Lillian Gilbreth was also responsible for the design of the foot pedal trash can, for wall light switches, and for the egg and butter holder inside your refrigerator. So next time you open your fridge, be sure to think of Lillian Gilbreth. So these developments in household technology actually allowed women to complete their chores, right, and household duties in a much faster amount of time and more efficiently. So, however, once new technology is released, with that comes the necessity to learn the skills to operate it, right? Have you ever experienced buying a particular product, it looked really great in the commercial and on TV, but then you open it and then it takes some time to learn how to use it. You have to read the instruction manual. So obviously the same thing stood for the development of these household appliances. But these patterns of change in housework actually correlated with two interesting factors. The first one is that divorce rates for those with a lower socioeconomic status increased. It was more likely for women who were married to men who did not make as much money, who did not have a higher income, to be more likely to divorce them and to leave. And the second thing is that the women started participating in the labor force. So women began searching for jobs in the industrial field, especially during the war. So sadly, during the war, the war had taken a lot of soldiers and a lot of good men, leaving the women single or widowed, and so they had to tend for themselves. So the way that they would do that is they would have these household appliances to, do their laundry, wash their dishes, all of these things, and it gave them much more time and the ability to actually find a job in the industrial area, and mostly in a factory, which is a picture that you see here. So the years following World War II were critical for the development of human factors. In 1945, the Human Factors Society was established along with engineering psychology laborers, and it was founded by the armed forces. Later, in 1949, the United Kingdom had founded the Ergonomics Research Society. Today, it is called the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. And so in 1957, there was an International Ergonomic Association that was founded to actually unite all of these different societies around the world. So today we have more than 36 members as part of this international association. Additionally, in 1957, there was the foundation of the United Kingdom Journal of Ergonomics, as well as the Journal of Applied Psychology. Both of these journals still exist today, and it's actually very interesting to see the different types of technology that had been researched from back then and the type of technology they research today. So I really encourage you to take a look and check those out. And lastly, in 1957, there was the publication of the first Human Factors book, titled Human Factors and Engineering in Design. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the influence of computers and the introduction of the internet on how we use technology today. So now we're going to talk about the influence of computers, right? So the war was the main reason that people finally decided that, you know what, we're going to create a computer, right? This became a reality. They had realized the first computer. And the first computer was called the Colossus, right? It was built in the United Kingdom during World War II, and it was designed to break German codes. However, it remained a secret for more than 30 years. So even though it was the first one that was created, it's not the first one that people are aware of. The first one that people are aware of was called the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Calculator. And it was one of the earliest computers made, and it was made in the United States in 1946. It was 3,000 cubic feet. It weighed 3 tons, and it consumed about 140 kilowatts of power. However, what really set it apart even from the first Colossus was that it was programmable, and it had a really large capacity, and it was capable of doing more than one job. And just to give you an idea, it was able to calculate trajectories that took humans 20 hours, and the computers were able to do it in 30 seconds. So if you can imagine in 1946, this is what was being created. Today it's 2017, and you can only imagine the advances that had been made in computers since then. And here on the right side of the screen, you see a picture of that first computer. So throughout the 1960s and 1970s, computers significantly advanced and evolved. It had really great processing power. Computers had a much larger memory capacity, and of course the larger your capacity, the more things you can store. It had faster speeds, smaller units, right? So obviously you don't have what is it, 3 tons, right? You don't, which one of you has a 3-ton computer? I'm sure nobody, right? So smaller units. Now we have laptops, we have phones that act as computers, right? So we're getting smaller and smaller, thinner and thinner, but still able to perform the same and much more tasks. As well as decreasing costs, right? So this is sort of not as true today, right? Every time there's a new advance in a new iPhone, right? Oh, it's $800, right? But of course, for that time, money, the economy was much different from the way it is today. So decreasing costs was a very big deal. So the computer became not only a property of a particular specialist or a scientist or an engineer, it actually became a pretty common item for the general population. And in 1978, it was the creation of the first PC, the first personal computer, and its main function was to act as a word processor. Computers replaced electrical typewriters, and people were able to attain much faster typing speeds with much less errors. And so with the influence of the internet, this just spans even further. So human-computer interaction became a really popular research area and topic of interest. And today we have a plethora of journals and societies and newspapers and magazines and, like various groups of people that are really interested in studying these things. So various conferences are still continued to be held. If you're interested, you can check out the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. There's usually a conference once a year. They have an annual one. They travel to different places in the US as well as around the world. They welcome new research, so if you're interested in conducting your own research in human factors, that's a really great way to be heard and to, voice your ideas and opinions. And so in 1990, right, this incredible thing happened. It was the introduction of the internet and the World Wide Web. This allowed for networking and sharing of information among various users. So if you think to yourself, what do you use the internet for today? So of course we have like this amazing medium and platform for me to give you these lectures online, right? This is us transferring information back and forth to each other across the entire world. You don't actually have to be present with someone in the same room to learn, to listen, right? We use we use the internet for social media is really hot these days, right? So as a social aspect, there is some debate about whether or not these social media platforms are replacing normal human-to-human interaction, and so we're going to talk about that. We have a visitor that will be, giving us their opinion, right? So I'm really excited to facilitate discussion about that. But in general, right, the internet has sort of become, the internet has become a substitute for communication for us, right? We don't even call each other on the phone as much anymore. We're more likely to send an email or a text message. So just think about the way you use the internet today. In 1993, only 1/3 of users of the internet were actually scientists or engineers. Majority of the public were actually using the internet for professional and personal needs, right? So we can also use the internet, right, for marketing, right, or websites. That's a really, really great avenue, and I'm sure that that's what people in the early 90s started doing. The internet also allows us to create, edit, exchange, and broadcast information. And so, of course, with these advances come human factors issues. Just like during the Industrial Revolution, when household appliances were created, when aircraft was created, when aviation, was taking off, all of these things, the more advancements you have, the more skills a user would need to learn in order to successfully operate them. So with the evolution of the internet, right, we started having issues related to information organization, access, security management, communication, and then, of course, the design of these different interfaces. So that concludes our lecture for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about the industrial evolution, about the early experiments of human factor psychology, about human factor psychology today, any and all questions are welcome. Please write to csundancingprofessor@gmail.com. Please subscribe to the channel so that you're informed of the new videos. Please look out for new case studies, new interviews with really interesting people in the industrial world today. And so, yeah, if you have any questions, please send them my way. Thanks so much.